May 8, 1945, dawned across a trembling world, its silence broken not by gunfire, but by the disbelief of exhausted survivors. The announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender rippled through cities and camps alike, leaving victory ringing hollow in hearts burdened by memory. In New York, church bells pealed through avenues draped in flags, while in London, weary crowds filled Trafalgar Square beneath a rain of confetti and tears. Across the Atlantic, in hundreds of guarded compounds, thousands of German prisoners stood in stunned quiet as American loudspeakers declared the war in Europe was over. The broadcasts reached the compound at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where women of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps had spent long months in confinement. Their uniforms had faded, their pride had dulled, and their thoughts wandered between relief and fear of an uncertain homecoming. Many had last seen Germany beneath bombs, their families scattered, and their towns reduced to ashes by relentless air raids. The American guards, too, felt the gravity of the moment, for their victory no longer seemed like triumph, but rather an exhausted ending to unimaginable loss. The camp's commandant, Colonel James W. Harlan, ordered the stars and stripes raised at dawn while instructing his men to read the surrender announcement aloud. The words carried through barbed wire and barracks alike, spoken clearly, yet met with an eerie stillness from behind the fences. Some prisoners saluted the flag in quiet respect, while others wept, realizing the Reich they served had ceased to exist. For the women, who had manned radios, typewriters, and telephones for officers long gone, the war's end felt less like liberation and more like identity erased. American newspapers that morning carried headlines proclaiming "Victory in Europe," though their smaller columns spoke grimly of concentration camps newly liberated. The prisoners at Fort Devens read them days later, learning of horrors previously dismissed as enemy propaganda. Each revelation struck with growing force, dismantling the moral certainty that once justified their service to the Reich's machine. In the evenings, when searchlights dimmed, conversations turned to homecomings that now seemed unrecognizable, and to families whose fates remained unknown. By nightfall, the camp was filled with conflicting emotions: joy, shame, fear, and an unspoken gratitude for survival beneath the enemy's flag. As celebrations erupted across America, the women behind the wire stood silent, sensing that the surrender marking freedom for millions might instead herald the beginning of a very different captivity, one measured not in chains, but in conscience and remembrance. Nestled among pine-covered hills north of Boston, Fort Devens appeared ordinary from the outside, its fences blending quietly into the landscape. Yet within its guarded perimeter, a small group of 14 women from the German Women's Auxiliary Corps lived lives suspended between duty abandoned and futures uncertain. They had arrived months earlier under military escort, captured in France, and later transferred through New Jersey before reaching Massachusetts by rail. Their uniforms bore fading insignia of an army that no longer existed, and their minds carried the disciplined silence drilled into them by a regime collapsing into chaos. The barracks assigned to the women stood apart from the larger male compounds, surrounded by double fencing and guarded day and night. Inside, the women maintained order with routines both familiar and futile. Beds aligned with precision, floors scrubbed to a dull shine, and uniforms mended despite having no future use. They spoke little of the war, though occasional whispers revealed memories of air raid sirens, burning cities, and the echo of orders shouted in collapsing headquarters. For many, the journey to Fort Devens marked not merely captivity, but an exile from a nation they no longer recognized. Their work duties within the camp reflected a strange blend of military discipline and human reconciliation. Some assisted in the camp infirmary, others helped organize supplies or clean administrative buildings alongside American personnel. These shared tasks gradually eroded the invisible barrier of enmity, replaced by cautious acknowledgement and mutual curiosity. To the guards, they were not the fanatical figures once depicted in wartime propaganda, but tired young women hardened by survival rather than ideology. For the women, The Americans' casual kindness contradicted everything they had been told about their enemies' cruelty. Letters arrived sporadically from Europe, carrying fragments of ruined addresses and news written between lines of censorship and despair. Some women learned their families were missing, others discovered their homes reduced to rubble, and a few received nothing at all. The camp library became their sanctuary, where they read English primers, borrowed magazines, and studied faces of soldiers smiling beside families in peaceful suburbs. Each image chipped away at long-held beliefs, forcing them to confront a new moral geography in which victors displayed humanity instead of vengeance. Outside Fort Devens, America celebrated peace, yet inside its forgotten fences, 14 German women lived a quieter revolution. Each passing week transformed captivity into reflection, discipline into humility, and the memory of obedience into the faint awakening of conscience. The officers assigned to Fort Devens had returned from Europe carrying memories not of glory, but of devastation beyond comprehension. Many had seen the shattered towns of Belgium, the skeletal remains of concentration camps, and the faces of displaced civilians wandering roads strewn with wreckage. Yet beneath the triumph of victory, a quieter resolve emerged, to rebuild the moral ground lost during years of total war. When the first female prisoners arrived, their presence posed both a challenge and an opportunity. How to balance justice with decency when hatred had so recently defined every order. Colonel James W. Harlan, the camp's commandant, was a career officer shaped by both discipline and compassion, having served as an instructor before the war. He gathered his men shortly after Germany's surrender and reminded them that their conduct toward captives would define America's character more than any battlefield triumph. His directive was simple, yet revolutionary in spirit. Treat the women not as enemies, but as people recovering from lies that had devoured their homeland. Under his leadership, guards replaced harsh protocols with measured fairness, allowing small freedoms that carried immense symbolic weight within the barbed perimeter. The Americans instituted programs that encouraged education, labor, and even limited recreation, believing rehabilitation began with dignity restored. Sergeant Daniel Roscoe, a former teacher from Illinois, organized English classes using worn textbooks and children's readers supplied by local charities. Each lesson became an exchange of cultures, revealing how shared laughter and patience could dissolve years of propaganda. Captain Mary O'Donnell, one of the few female officers stationed there, oversaw the infirmary where German women assisted American nurses, gradually transforming suspicion into cooperation through compassion expressed in routine care. Rumors of this leniency reached other camps, prompting criticism from certain quarters that mercy undermined the purpose of imprisonment. Yet the officers of Fort Devens remained unmoved, convinced that moral victory required restraint rather than retaliation. Reports submitted to the War Department emphasized that respectful treatment produced better discipline, fewer incidents, and surprising gratitude among the detainees. Behind those statistics, however, lay something deeper. Small gestures of kindness that rebuilt fragments of humanity on both sides of the wire. By summer's end, the women's barracks had become more than a detention zone. It was a quiet laboratory of reconciliation. In the shadow of victory's devastation, American officers discovered that genuine triumph resided not in domination, but in the courage to act with mercy when vengeance seemed easiest. The summer of 1945 unfolded gently across Massachusetts, its warmth softening the rigid atmosphere surrounding the compound at Fort Devens. By then, daily life within the fences had adopted a rhythm marked not by authority, but by quiet cooperation and hesitant understanding. It began with language lessons conducted in the mess hall, where Sergeant Daniel Roscoe arranged benches into rows and distributed alphabet charts scrounged from a nearby school. The women, once clerks and radio operators of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, sat attentively, their notebooks filled with careful English phrases written beside fading German translations. At first, communication relied upon gestures, sketches, and uncertain smiles exchanged across the gulf of unfamiliar words. Yet, with each passing week, laughter replaced formality as pronunciation errors and playful corrections turned classrooms into scenes of unexpected warmth. The Americans discovered the women's humor, dry, precise, and shaped by years of military decorum slowly dissolving in the face of kindness. In return, the prisoners began to see their instructors not as wardens, but as companions whose empathy transcended the boundaries of uniform and allegiance. The camp, once a place of watchtowers and suspicion, gradually echoed with human voices rather than commands. Captain Mary O'Donnell noticed the transformation most vividly within the infirmary, where German volunteers learned English medical terms while assisting American nurses. They practiced through dialogue and laughter, fumbling over phrases like bandage and thermometer, their mispronunciations provoking gentle amusement instead of reprimand. Each shared moment became a small act of defiance against the hatred that had once separated their nations. Outside the infirmary, others helped mend uniforms, paint walls, and plant small gardens near the fence, gestures that restored both beauty and normalcy to a space built for confinement. Evenings often ended with informal gatherings, where guards and prisoners listened together to music broadcast over the camp loudspeakers. Swing melodies mingled with fragments of old German folk songs, creating an atmosphere neither wholly American nor entirely foreign. In those moments, the women began to feel something they had not experienced since before the war, a sense of belonging untainted by ideology. The fences remained, yet emotionally they began to fade, replaced by the fragile architecture of trust. By autumn, friendships once unimaginable had taken root in that unlikely place. Through shared words, laughter, and ordinary compassion, the prisoners and their captors constructed a language beyond politics, one built not of vocabulary but of mutual respect, proving that even within confinement, humanity could still find its voice. By late autumn of 1945, the mail that reached Fort Devens carried more than words. It carried the weight of a shattered homeland. Each envelope arrived wrinkled, censored, and stamped with foreign markings, traveling through a labyrinth of Allied inspection before reaching trembling hands within the camp. The German women gathered quietly in the barracks each afternoon as the postal sergeant called names, his voice echoing across the narrow corridor like a fragile link to a world that barely existed. For many, the letters inside were the first tangible contact with home since their capture months earlier. The messages revealed scenes of ruin far beyond imagination, cities reduced to ash, railways twisted into scrap, and families scattered by the chaos of surrender. Mothers described lines for bread stretching for hours, fathers missing in Soviet captivity, and neighbors surviving in cellars beneath roofs blown apart by Allied bombs. Some letters contained no words at all, only short fragments written in trembling hands that betrayed despair deeper than language could express. The women who read them wept silently, not for defeat, but for the realization that the Germany they had defended had perished long before the surrender was signed. The camp radio amplified these revelations as American broadcasts carried reports from Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich describing starvation, occupation, and the trials beginning at Nuremberg. Translators read aloud newspaper excerpts about concentration camps and civilian suffering, stories once dismissed as wartime fabrications now verified by Allied cameras and testimonies. The women listened in stunned disbelief, their eyes searching the floor as if the truth itself were unbearable to face. Some defended their ignorance, insisting they had served only in clerical roles, while others sat speechless, overcome by the slow collapse of their moral certainty. In the evenings, the barracks filled with whispered confessions, fragments of guilt, and attempts to reconcile loyalty with shame. The Americans, aware of their captives' emotional turmoil, offered empathy rather than judgment, providing reading materials that explained Reconstruction efforts and the vision of a democratic Germany. Captain Mary O'Donnell introduced Red Cross counselors who encouraged open discussion, transforming despair into fragile acceptance. Through those conversations, the women began to understand that repentance could coexist with hope, and that acknowledging truth was itself an act of rebuilding. By winter, the camp's atmosphere had changed irrevocably. Behind the fences, 14 German women confronted the ashes of a nation once glorified as eternal. In that confrontation, they discovered a painful, yet liberating revelation, that only through truth could they begin to reclaim their humanity. The morning of November 3rd, 1945, began with the usual sounds of reveille echoing through the camp. Yet something in the air felt different. Guards stood a little straighter, officers moved with hushed urgency, and rumors swept through the barracks like a rising wind before a storm. By midday, the announcement came. Official orders from Washington directing the release and repatriation of all remaining German prisoners within American custody. For most detainees across the country, it was the long-awaited end to captivity. But inside the women's compound at Fort Devens, silence greeted the proclamation. Colonel James W. Harlan assembled the 14 women in the mess hall, reading the directive with the formal gravity it demanded. His voice, steady yet solemn, carried through the still air as interpreters repeated the words in careful German. "You are free to go," he concluded, folding the paper and resting it upon the lectern like a symbolic closure to months of shared endurance. Yet no applause followed, no cheers or tears of joy. Only the soft creak of benches as the women exchanged uncertain glances. Freedom, the concept they had dreamed of, now appeared as a doorway leading into the unknown. For some, home existed only as a memory of streets that no longer stood, of families whose fate remained unanswered by letters. Others feared the judgment awaiting them in a country where former auxiliaries were branded traitors or collaborators. The Allies' denazification commissions had begun interrogating returning personnel, and stories spread of women ostracized, imprisoned, or reduced to destitution upon arrival. The safety they had found within American fences, steady meals, warmth, civility, and unexpected respect, suddenly seemed more stable than the broken homeland awaiting them. Each woman wrestled privately with the question of belonging. Was captivity still captivity if it offered dignity absent at home? The Americans prepared transport trucks for Boston Harbor, where ships awaited to return the prisoners to Europe. Packing lists were distributed, personal belongings inventoried, and good-natured farewells exchanged with guards who had long ceased to view them as enemies. Yet beneath the surface, tension grew as hesitation turned to quiet defiance. That evening, when Colonel Harlan passed by the women's barracks, he found several still seated by their bunks, possessions untouched, faces pale but resolved. They did not look like prisoners preparing for freedom. They looked like exiles clinging to the last place that had treated them as human. Night settled heavily over Fort Devens, the searchlights casting thin beams across fences soon to be meaningless. The war had ended months ago, yet within those 14 hearts, a new battle had begun, between the memory of homeland and the unfamiliar mercy of former foes. The morning following the repatriation order began with a sight no one in Fort Devens could have foreseen. 14 German women standing outside the commandant's office, waiting in silence beneath the pale November sky. They wore their faded auxiliary uniforms neatly pressed, hands clasped before them with military precision, though their expressions carried neither defiance nor fear. When Colonel James W. Harlan arrived, expecting compliance with departure preparations, they stepped forward as one. Their spokesperson, a former communications clerk named Helene Bauer, spoke in halting English, shaped by months of patient lessons. Her voice trembled as she uttered the words that would soon echo across military channels. "We wish to remain here, sir. We do not want to go home." The colonel, believing he had misheard, requested clarification through an interpreter. Yet their plea remained unchanged, firm, yet sorrowful, born not of rebellion, but of desperation. The women explained that their homes were gone, their families displaced, their future in Germany uncertain beneath occupation and resentment. They feared being branded collaborators, refused work, or left destitute in the ruins of cities once familiar. Here, within the American camp, they said, they had found stability, purpose, and a strange peace unknown even before the war. Their request defied logic, policy, and every precedent in the record of prisoner repatriation. Word of the plea spread swiftly among the American staff, provoking astonishment, sympathy, and bureaucratic confusion. Regulation dictated that all prisoners must be repatriated without exception, yet no officer wished to force women toward misery they feared. Colonel Harlan forwarded an urgent report to the War Department, describing the petition as an unprecedented act of voluntary continued detention. Journalists who caught wind of the story labeled it everything from sentimental folly to a moral miracle, igniting debate about whether compassion could coexist with military discipline. For the women, however, it was neither political nor philosophical. It was survival chosen with dignity rather than despair. While awaiting official response, the colonel allowed them temporary stay, assigning routine duties and ensuring their safety from local hostility. Letters of inquiry were dispatched to Washington, and interviews conducted by Army psychologists concluded that the women's motives were sincere, not manipulative. Days passed into weeks, and still no transport came. Within the fences, life resumed quietly, though every conversation carried the weight of uncertainty. By Christmas, the women decorated the mess hall with paper garlands and shared gifts made from ration scraps alongside their American counterparts. What had begun as captivity had transformed into community, and in that fragile unity, they proved that humanity's deepest allegiance was not to flags or nations, but to the compassion that endures beyond war. The petition from Fort Devens arrived in Washington wrapped in disbelief, its language both respectful and revolutionary for a world emerging from total war. Bureaucrats within the War Department examined the typed memorandum twice before realizing that 14 German women were pleading to remain voluntary captives under American protection. The question leapt beyond procedure into the uneasy territory of ethics, politics, and national image. What did it mean when enemies refused liberation, preferring the custody of their conquerors to the freedom of their homeland? The issue quickly escalated through channels unprepared for moral ambiguity amid administrative victory. Meetings convened within the Pentagon, drawing officers, diplomats, and legal advisors who viewed the case as a challenge to post-war order. Some argued that compassion had already been extended far enough, insisting the women's request violated international repatriation agreements established under the Geneva Convention. Others, however, contended that forcing them back into hardship would contradict the humanitarian ideals America claimed to uphold. Behind closed doors, memoranda circulated questioning whether mercy could exist within regulation, and whether moral responsibility ended at the gates of surrender. Each argument revealed the deeper struggle of a nation defining its role as both victor and moral example. Congressional subcommittees soon became aware of the affair, their reactions divided between outrage and admiration. Isolationists warned that leniency toward former enemies might set dangerous precedent, while reformists saw in it a chance to demonstrate the strength of democratic compassion. Newspapers picked up the story, framing it alternately as sentimental folly or as proof that America's humanity outlasted its anger. Letters poured into Washington from citizens moved by the women's courage, some offering sponsorships or employment should they be allowed to stay. The case of the Fort Devens women transformed from obscure administrative question into public debate about the very soul of victory. Ultimately, the War Department deferred to civilian authorities, forwarding the matter to the State Department and the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Legal scholars pored over precedents, discovering none that applied precisely to voluntary retention of enemy personnel. After weeks of deliberation, officials quietly authorized temporary residence for the 14, pending review of their individual circumstances. It was not a pardon, nor an endorsement, merely an acknowledgement that humanity sometimes defies paperwork. In the capital's marble corridors, their story lingered long after decisions were filed away. It whispered of a truth many wished forgotten, that the measure of victory was not conquest, but the mercy extended to those who once stood opposed. By early 1946, the official papers granting temporary residence arrived at Fort Devens, carried in sealed envelopes marked with military insignia and bureaucratic restraint. The 14 women, once prisoners of an enemy nation, gathered before Colonel James W. Harlan as he read the decision aloud with measured pride. They were no longer detainees but residents under supervised civilian sponsorship, free to work within communities that had once viewed them with suspicion. The transformation was extraordinary in its quietness. There were no ceremonies, no headlines, only a few emotional farewells exchanged between captors who had become protectors. Freedom had finally come. yet it carried the texture of gratitude rather than celebration. Several of the women were placed with local families or institutions willing to offer them employment and supervision. 2 joined a nearby hospital in Worcester, where their discipline and compassion quickly earned trust among American nurses still mourning brothers lost overseas. Another found work as a teacher's assistant in a Boston language school, translating German literature for returning soldiers pursuing education under the new GI Bill. Others worked on farms across Massachusetts and Connecticut, their labor helping feed a nation rebuilding from rationing and loss. Each assignment represented not charity, but an experiment in reconciliation, a test of whether kindness could truly erase the memory of war. Public reaction remained divided. Some communities welcomed them with cautious curiosity, while others protested that former enemies had no place among American families. Yet, wherever they went, their humility and determination gradually softened resentment. Local newspapers began describing them not as enemy aliens but as war refugees, signaling a subtle shift in the nation's vocabulary. The women themselves lived carefully, conscious that every gesture reflected not only upon them but upon the country that had chosen mercy over vengeance. They studied English at night, attended church on Sundays, and wrote letters to sponsors expressing gratitude for second chances they believed unearned. Over time, their presence inspired quiet influence upon policy and perception alike. Reports from Fort Devens and similar cases helped shape post-war humanitarian initiatives and refugee resettlement programs introduced in later decades. Scholars who later examined the episode saw in it the embryonic beginnings of reconciliation between former adversaries, a model of coexistence grounded in moral courage rather than political design. Within a few short years, the story faded from headlines, but its legacy endured in hospital wards, classrooms, and farmlands, where compassion had proven stronger than memory. The women of Fort Devens, once symbols of defeat, had become living bridges between nations, learning again how to trust. Decades passed, and the story of the 14 women from Fort Devens became a quiet legend, known to few yet remarkable in its consequences. Those who had once served the German war effort were now American citizens, their legal papers confirming a transformation as profound as any battlefield victory. Naturalization ceremonies were simple, attended by American friends who had once been their guards, neighbors who had supported their integration, and occasionally reporters seeking the human story behind official records. The women, modest and reflective, accepted their citizenship not with pride in conquest, but with gratitude for lives reborn in peace. Their transition was neither immediate nor easy. Lingering prejudice occasionally shadowed workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods, testing patience and resilience. Yet their determination to contribute positively to society prevailed, establishing reputations as dedicated nurses, teachers, and community organizers. They spoke little of their former service in Germany, choosing instead to emphasize lessons learned about morality, empathy, and the consequences of blind obedience. Through decades of quiet labor, mentorship, and engagement in civic life, these women became symbols of the human capacity for reinvention and moral courage in the aftermath of war's destruction. Historians later examined Fort Devens as a singular case study in reconciliation, noting how small acts of kindness and institutional flexibility could reshape the lives of former enemies. Their story was cited in academic works on post-war immigration, prisoner of war policy, and transitional justice, revealing the long-term impact of humane treatment in a system otherwise governed by regulation and retribution. Museums and historical societies occasionally featured their photographs, letters, and oral histories, framing them as living bridges between nations once locked in mortal combat. By the 21st century, surviving women from the Fort Devens group had attended reunions with American friends who had shaped their post-war lives, sharing laughter and memory over decades of shared experience. Conversations reflected not only personal survival, but collective reflection on the moral choices that had allowed mercy to prevail over vengeance. They spoke of forgiveness, the value of dignity, and the power of agency, even when history's weight seemed insurmountable. Ultimately, their lives illustrated that war's conclusion did not merely return prisoners to freedom, but offered a rare opportunity to redefine identity, loyalty, and humanity itself. From captured auxiliaries to American citizens, the women of Fort Devens demonstrated that compassion can transcend conflict, that courage extends beyond the battlefield, and that the human will to rewrite destiny remains unstoppable even in the shadow of history's darkest chapters.